We have a vision of Nixon. Richard Nixon as president, Richard Nixon as a candidate, Richard Nixon as a person. And to be quite honest, I think starting with Nixon and all the way to where we're going to end the semester, I think we're too close to the events to really give them a fair interpretation. In fact, you know, Richard Nixon was president when I was a boy, when I was a little toddler, and I faintly remember Watergate. But we see in the popular culture, if you want to make fun of a politician, if you really want to attack a politician, there's two routes that opposition generally goes. It's either the Hitler route or the Nixon route. And you know, if they're totally evil, you call a politician Hitler. But if you want mildly evil, then Nixon. And so we have this view of Richard Nixon as corrupt, incompetent, bumbling, the specter of criminality hanging over him. And that's not the Nixon of most of his political career. While it may, with some sadness, reflect the last years of his political life, Richard Nixon was an incredibly brilliant politician, an incredibly brilliant statesman. He did things during his presidency that hadn't been accomplished in a score of years. And Richard Nixon has enjoyed somewhat of a renaissance in the modern era after his death. Richard Nixon was more appreciated after he died in the 90s. He's been more appreciated now than he was during his lifetime. He was an incredibly eloquent speaker, a master of diplomacy, a patriot who sacrificed his ego and ultimately his career to spare the country a constitutional crisis. And I'm specifically referring to the 1960 election and the constitutional crisis of the 1960s. And this is the paradox of Nixon. He was willing to fall on his sword in the 1960s election. He was willing to take defeat rather than go to the courts. And yet, he would ultimately, because of that paranoia of the defeat of 1960, would do things in the 1972 campaign that will bring about an even greater constitutional crisis, would certainly sully his name for the next generation, and would embitter his legacy even to the modern age. Nixon had served as a representative in the House of Representatives from California, representing the District of Northern Los Angeles County area, and Whittier, where he grew up and went to college. He represents California in the U.S. House for 2 terms after the end of World War II and his discharge from the Navy, where he served with distinction. He was elected to the U.S. Senate from California, serving 2 years before accepting an offer as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, as you already know from previous videos. He would serve 2 terms as vice president of the United States from 1953 to 1961, and then he would run as president in his own right in 1960. Nixon should have been president in 1961. One of the connections of life, of the modern age to the past, is going on right now. And I can't predict the future as to whether she'll be president or whether she's just a candidate or she's just a name in the history books. But Hillary Clinton today provides a connection with Richard Nixon. She will serve on the Judiciary Committee's staff to write the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon that never come to fruition, but she was an ardent attacker of Richard Nixon in the 1970s. And ironically, it will come up again with her husband in office in the 1990s and those very issues of impeachment. But even before that, Hillary Clinton had studied Richard Nixon and the 1960s campaign, and Hillary Clinton is no fan of the Republicans and certainly not of the right, although I'll argue that Richard Nixon isn't right-wing. He's middle of the road, not a right-winger. But Hillary Clinton once wrote in a paper for law school that Richard Nixon had been cheated out of the 1960 election, which was no news to Richard Nixon. I'm not sure he was even aware of her study paper in law school, but he knew it at the time. He knew that with the swinging of two states, Texas and Illinois, he would have been president. But he decided to spare the nation a constitutional crisis through the challenge of John F. Kennedy's presidency, which is complicated by the fact that Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were friends. Were until the 1960 campaign. And so Nixon merely bided his time from 1961 through 1968. He stumped for other candidates. He was one of the biggest Republican Party cheerleaders for other candidates, would appear in speaking engagements and do the things that party associates are supposed to do to further the party. And he reemerged on the national scene in 1968, a tanned, arrested, a refreshed, a ready-to-go Richard Nixon. He had already come under fire in the 1968 campaign from Bobby Kennedy's political machine. But with the death of Bobby Kennedy, Richard Nixon easily defeated Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 election, which we've already talked about. But he certainly was able to show a dominant performance in the 68 election. And in winning the presidency, Nixon had put his finger on the pulse of Middle America. He had an appeal to the mass of quiet voters in the background who opposed the Great Society, who were not fans of the Vietnam War, but didn't want to see the country lose the Vietnam War. Americans who were afraid of the country progressing further down the road of the Great Society and the liberal reforms that had been implemented by Lyndon Johnson. In fact, Richard Nixon will coin a name for these people. He called them the silent majority. And he called upon the silent majority, and they provided a groundswell of support that swept him into the White House in 1968. He stated in his nomination speech going into the 68 election cycle, he said, and I quote, "When the strongest nation in the world can be tied down for 4 years in a war in Vietnam with no end in sight, when the richest nation in the world can't manage its own economy, when the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented racial violence, when the President of the United States cannot travel abroad or to any major city at home, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America." End quote. Richard Nixon tapped into what most Americans were feeling, that America was out of control. America, whether it was or wasn't, is irrelevant. The silent majority responded to Richard Nixon's siren call, and they answered, sweeping him and his slate of cabinet members into office, led by the very able and eloquent Spiro Agnew. This group of as one historian said, this magnificent group of second-raters, of backbenchers, not a millionaire in the lot, all came into power to guide Nixon's policies. His first real decision as president would be to nominate a replacement for the retiring Earl Warren. Remember, Earl Warren was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, nominated by Dwight Eisenhower, and he decided to step down. Nixon is then in a position to choose his replacement, and he chooses Justice Warren Burger. And the Congress confirmed Chief Justice Warren Burger, placing him in the court in time to deal with some major issues. The major issue that is ripping the nation apart in 1968, 69, 70, 71 is the issue of desegregation. The court had decided through Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s that the nation would be desegregated, reversing their opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, changing their stance and saying that it's time to move on. It's time to provide racial justice. And Brown versus Board of Education calls for the desegregation of schools. Here's the problem that Nixon and Eisenhower before him had. While the court can declare it, how it's done isn't the job of the courts. The courts don't make law. They interpret the constitutionality of already made law. And so in Nixon's view, he doesn't want to get involved in the desegregation, especially of schools, unless he absolutely has to. It's not an issue that he's passionate about. He's not against it. He's just not for it. But a number of issues force his hand as school desegregation moves forward, as Nixon states, and I quote, "There are those who want instant integration, and there are those who want segregation forever. I believe we need to have a middle course between the extremes." And so that's exactly what Nixon tries to accomplish, a middle course between the extremes. However, he's not going to be able to sit this one out. In 1969, the Burger Court issued a unanimous decision in Alexander versus Holmes County Board of Education, declaring that Mississippi schools must be desegregated forthwith. And so Nixon, taking that as a national mandate, pushes for schools nationwide to desegregate, even if that means busing students from one neighborhood to another, one community to another, to bring out a racial balance in the schools. And in fact, beginning in 1969, 1970, Richard Nixon's administration will integrate more schools, which means they desegregate more schools than Kennedy and Johnson combined. And I've read textbooks that take Nixon to task as a segregationist. They accuse him of being a racist. But Nixon believed in constitutional parameters and that there are ways to go about it. And it was the job of the Congress to make the law. It was the job of the Congress, not the courts, to make decisions with regard to busing. And in fact, in 1971, that very issue comes up in Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that cities must bus students out of their neighborhoods if necessary to achieve integration. It was one thing for desegregation to go on in the South, but the North liked to pretend that it didn't have racial problems, that it didn't have racial issues, and that Jim Crow and segregation wasn't a problem in the North. But in fact, that's not true. And beginning with Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, riots began in northern cities, Boston, Denver, Pontiac, Michigan, Detroit. And so other cities denounced the destruction of what they called neighborhood schools, even to the point in Pontiac, Michigan, angry parents firebombed school buses. not with children on them, by the way, but they protested by destroying the school buses that would be used in busing. And in a few instances, busing made the trip to school shorter for some students, but in other schools, it made the trip to school extremely long, taking students from one school district or one community to a totally different school district or community where they have no friends, they have no roots, and it created a problem in all areas, black and white, with busing and desegregation through judicial action. So much so that Nixon, because of the protest, because of the response, and not to defend the indefensible, if you see Nixon as a racist, I'm not going to be able to persuade you otherwise, but Nixon is trying to follow a constitutional parameter. And when he sees the protest, he sees the people upset, just like with the Vietnam War, he takes their protests seriously. He just knows what has to be accomplished to bring about the desired result. So with Nixon and busing, he goes to Congress and asks Congress to pass a series of cease and desist laws that will end busing until new laws could be passed that will ease the process. The House, always more responsive to the people than the Senate, because the representatives elected from the local districts are more attuned to local issues. The House passed the bill that Nixon requested. The Senate, however, filibustered the bill to death and blocked the anti-busing order. And so riots and protests throughout the country would continue, but especially in the North, until 1974, in a court case, Milliken, M-I-L-I-K-E-N, Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court ordered a halt to desegregation in Detroit because it was requiring students to be bused from the inner cities to the suburbs, and the court declared that that type of busing was unconstitutional. And in a number of instances, by the way, it was incredibly unsafe. These little kids from the inner cities are riding not on school buses. Many of these big cities don't have school buses. They're in cooperative relationships with the city's buses. And so city transport is used to get people back and forth to work or wherever they're going, but also to bus kids to school. And it was unsafe in many instances for little kids to be riding on these city buses. And so the court declared that it was unconstitutional. And then after Nixon's presidency in 1978, but following that same theme, Bakke versus Board of Regents, California, B-A-K-K-E, Bakke versus Board of Regents, California, the Supreme Court restricted the use of quotas to achieve racial balance with regard to school integration and desegregation. And so you see the transformation, the transformation of the civil rights movement to a quest for simple justice to one of individual liberties and individual rights. And it's not blanketly correct to say all whites were against busing or all whites were in favor of busing, any more than it is to say all blacks were in favor of busing one way or the other. It depended on your community, it depended on your locale, depended on your school district, depended on a whole lot of other factors. But Nixon's first real challenge of his presidency deals with the court and carrying out court decisions and trying to place it in what he viewed as a more constitutional footing. To add to or to aid Nixon, to add to his woes or aid him in his accomplishments, Vice President Spiro Agnew can be viewed as either an asset or a liability. Spiro Agnew had been governor of Maryland, and he was a very eloquent speaker. And in fact, he came up with some incredibly brilliant turns of phrase. And in 1969, and picture in your mind what's going on in 1969. You have racial protests going on across the nation, but especially in the West Coast, California, San Francisco regions, and in the urbanized North, New England and Detroit and places like that. But you also have protests of the Vietnam War. You just had 1968 and the Democratic Convention, nominating convention of 1968, which turned into a bloody feud with the police being called in with dogs and clubs to silence the protesters outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago. You have a nation that's ripping itself apart. And so Nixon sends Spiro Agnew out on a nationwide tour in which he made a number of turns of phrase, and I've put them here, but in reference to the Vietnam War protesters that wouldn't even consider what was necessary to win the war. It was stop the war immediately at whatever the cost, which is a totally crazy notion that any nation would do that. But he referred to them as anarchist and ideological eunuchs. He referred to the press corps, which often, and you see this today, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right or whether you're on the middle, depending on the channel you watch, depending on the program that you watch, which, by the way, is the way the American press has always been. There are those today who protest and say, well, the press isn't fair. The press is supposed to be neutral. The press has never been neutral. When newspapers were founded in the United States, they were founded to support political candidates. You had newspapers founded to support and sponsor and further the Federalist agenda, and they didn't care what the Democratic Republicans were writing or saying. They simply didn't carry that news. And then you had Democratic Republican newspapers created to carry Democratic Republican news and to attack the Federalist. That has always been the tradition in the United States. Only in this modern era with university programs, with media programs and journalism programs, has there even approached this idea of neutrality of the press. The press isn't neutral, never has been. But you see it today, left and right, they take up their issues with Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, whatever. They grind their ideological axe. And the Nixon administration took more than their fair share of shots. The left didn't like Nixon from the 1950s or even earlier, 1940s. They didn't like his attacks on socialist or communist candidates winning election into the House of Representatives, and they didn't like him any of the years since. And many in the press turned this into attacks on Nixon and or Agnew or the administration or the nation as a whole. And so Spiro Agnew referred to them as an effete corps of impudent snobs. An effete corps of impudent snobs. That's just, okay, it may be rude and condescending if you look up what all that means, but it's still a nice turn of phrase. He referred to those protesting the Vietnam War and attacking the economy and attacking all the attempts at reform and that America was wrong and blamed for everything. He called them nattering nabobs of negativism. Don't you know people like that in your life? Nattering nabobs of negativism. There's never anything good going on in their life. You could give them a gold brick and they're going to find some reason that having that gold brick or winning the lottery or whatever is gloom and doom. And then he said in supporting the Nixon administration, he said it was, and I quote, time to rip away the rhetoric and divide on authentic lines. When the president said, bring us together, he meant functioning, contributing portions of the American citizenry, end quote. What does he mean? Well, he's saying those people out there, the pot-smoking hippies, the druggies of the left that aren't contributing to society, they're not participating in fact, they're working against. Why should we work on unifying with them? Because they're not really working to unify with us. And so only those who are making a contribution to society, and that's not aimed at white, black, rich, poor, a poor person working is making that contribution. So he's saying we mean to bring together the functioning, contributing portions of the American citizenry. You see how this would be a firebrand of controversy, and it certainly sparked on the left a desire to attack and remove Spiro Agnew, which will come to fruition, but later. President Nixon brought to the presidency a desire to transform the relationship with states, but at the same time he had some very specific ideas when it came to the economy. Now here's one of the areas that you can see Nixon as possibly leaning conservative, but then he follows it with ideas and concepts that are clearly leaning to the left. And so I would argue that Nixon's a moderate. He's not right-wing. He's not left-wing. He's a moderate. And one of the problems with the economy is that the American economy had stagnated. Even worse than that, not only was the economy not growing, the nation was beginning to suffer under staggering inflation. The annual inflation rate in 1967 was 3%. By 1973, it was 9%. By 1974, it was 12%. And throughout the 1970s, so for the presidency of Nixon, Ford, and Carter, the inflation rate is going to remain in double digits. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means something that cost $5 in 1967 or 1966. By 1979, that $5 good, its price has increased over 12%. Or more. I remember my dad coming home from work grumbling about the rate of inflation and that it was so expensive to go to the grocery store. It's so expensive to fill the car with gas because goods and services cost more. But at the same time, goods and services were costing more, and yet the economy's not growing. And in fact, they will coin a very specific phrase to reflect it. It was called stagflation. Something that economists said couldn't happen together. You couldn't have stagnation and inflation at the same time. And so in general, throughout the 1970s, you have an economic malaise. I would even argue it goes beyond an economic malaise. You have the by mid-1970s, you have Watergate, you have the end of the Vietnam War, you have President Carter giving up the Panama Canal. It seemed in every area of the nation there were problems. The nation was in retreat. The nation was suffering under scandals and failures, and everything seemed to be wrong with the United States. And so it was more than just an economic malaise. It was a national malaise, a national funk, which is kind of ironic since funk comes from the 1970s in the music industry. And so stagflation and economic malaise sets in, and it's caused by a number of things. Two historians, Tyndall and Shai, argue that the economic malaise had threefold roots. The first was the attempt by the Johnson administration to fund both the Vietnam War and the Great Society without new sources of funding. Now, I'm not a big fan of tax increases, but Tyndall and Shai say that the failure to increase taxes generated larger federal deficits, and with larger federal deficits, that led to inflation and a slowing and then a stoppage of the economy. So the attempts to pay for the Vietnam War and the Great Society without new taxation and without new sources of revenue. See, I would argue the other direction. I would go with Kennedy and Eisenhower and all the way back to the Coolidge years. And I would argue with Andrew Mellon the way to increase your revenues to lower taxes. But that's an argument for the 80s with Ronald Reagan. So the attempts to fight the war and pay for the Great Society by the Johnson administration led to the malaise. Secondly, they say that the 1960s American goods faced stiff competition from those that we conquered in World War II. Increased German industrial output, certainly increased Japanese output, and so stiff trade competition in international markets produced a stagnation of the American market. And then finally, energy costs. The United States production demanded cheap energy. In the Yom Kippur War, when the Yom Kippur War breaks out between Israel and its neighbors, the United States supports Israel. To punish the United States, OPEC jacks up its price for oil 400%. And this drives the cost of energy through the roof, and we'll talk about that again. Well, I might as well do it now with the... Hey, where'd my picture go? Well, we'll get to it later then. The creation of long gas lines as gas became more and more expensive, and with OPEC reducing production and increasing prices, Americans were sitting in gas lines. They were desperate for gas to get to work, and it added to that malaise. Nixon's program of economics was called New Federalism. He introduced a 5-year revenue sharing plan to return money to the states. So you can see in that a tad bit of conservatism with a credence to states' rights. He said that federal tax dollars would go back to the states. 1/3 of that money could be used by the states for whatever they needed, and 2/3 would go to local governments. All of that without strings, and would enable local and state governments to do more for their citizenry. Now that's federal tax money collected through the income tax and collected through various other taxation. The problem with that, the problem with revenue sharing, and Congress does pass it, it's a 5-year plan. At the end of the 5 years, you've got the states addicted to that money coming back, and when they lose it, then you're going to have an even greater decline. And so that's exactly what happens. The states and local governments get used to that money being in their revenue stream for 5 years, and then when it's cut out, they feel entitled to continue receiving it. But by that point, the federal government's already running a deficit. They don't have the money to send back to the states. And so the 5-year revenue sharing plan was a nice idea that didn't really work. Add to that, Nixon had declared in his campaign that he was absolutely dead set against wage and price controls. But then in 1971, to combat the ever-increasing amount of inflation, the Nixon administration imposed a freeze on wages and prices. And so for 90 days, everyone's wages were frozen at whatever point they were, and prices were frozen. And then at the end of 90 days, there was a complex system of wage and price controls that kicked in so that certain items could increase, but they couldn't increase in conjunction with other items, and it was extremely complex. And it's not a conservative approach. That's certainly Harry Truman had instituted wage and price controls. In fact, that's probably where Nixon got the idea, was from Harry Truman immediately after World War II. And so Nixon takes ideas like wage and price controls, which doesn't help his support with that silent majority, but they're willing to go along with him, but it doesn't end the economic malaise. The economy becomes so bad that Nixon decides to end the U.S. participation in the gold standard. And so Nixon officially takes the nation off of the gold standard in the 1970s and instead pegs the dollar to oil. And this creates some of the problems that we're having today. Nixon did enjoy some successes while president, even though they may not have been his doing. He's certainly the president to make the longest long-distance phone call in American history, with President Nixon being in office during the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Now, tip of the hat to those of you who don't believe that ever took place. So for those naysayers and conspiracy theorists, Nixon may well just be talking to himself or talking to an astronaut on the other side of the Earth. But either way, I'm astronaut theorists notwithstanding, the conventional wisdom is Nixon talks to Neil Armstrong on the moon, and then you see Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, they're on the moon, and then they're returned to Earth in quarantine, and Nixon meets with him. So Nixon is president when Kennedy's vision is fulfilled. Now, to be fair, Nixon was vice president when NASA was created. It's the brainchild of Eisenhower, and Nixon played a part in that. So it was the infrastructure was created under a Nixon participating administration, but then it certainly was the brainchild of Kennedy, and given its vision to put a man on the moon by the end of the year. And so July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong on the moon, and the moon landings accomplished that great goal of reaching the moon and returning them safely to Earth. And they will follow those moon landings with Apollo 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Of course, Apollo 13 not landing on the moon, but instead having an emergency and orbiting the moon and then returning to Earth. And so the Apollo program reaches fruition. Now, a Nixon-led initiative that spills over into the Ford years is to use the space program as a goodwill program with the Soviets and to further détente into space. And so the Apollo-Soyuz program will be born out of this, where Soviet and American craft will link up in space, and they will share technology and information and have a good PR program in place of look how good the superpowers are cooperating. But Nixon is going to reap the benefits of the successes of the Apollo program. Nixon is also responsible for what has been called détente. Détente is a lessening of tensions between the superpowers. The Communist Party chairman and General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. And you see the pictures there of Brezhnev and Nixon. And in fact, in retrospect, Mikhail Gorbachev, a decade later, will refer to the Brezhnev years as the Brezhnev malaise. So the Soviet Union experiences some decline during the Brezhnev years as well. But Nixon had a warm relationship with Brezhnev, and there would be a lot of progress toward easing the tensions between the two superpowers. The first would be the Seabed Treaty. the Seabed Treaty of 1970. It would ban the testing of nuclear weapons on the ocean floor, especially in international waters, and would then therefore eliminate contamination of the ocean's waters, and was seen as an environmental boon. And then they would follow that up with the Chemical Weapons Treaty of 1971. The Chemical Weapons Treaty. The Chemical Weapons Treaty of 1971 was an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union to destroy stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, to ban further development of those weapons, and to, in essence, deal more civilly in international conflicts. And so the Chemical Weapons Treaty of 1971 is an attempt to ratchet back some of the worst aspects of the Cold War. Kind of the pinnacle of the Brezhnev-Nixon détente is the signing of the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which severely curtailed the production of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The SALT agreements, while not ending the conflict, certainly by reducing the number of warheads, of the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the construction of anti-ballistic missile systems. So you have the restriction of ICBMs and the restriction of ABMs. The Soviets were able to maintain an edge in number of missiles, and they had an edge in destructive power. But the United States, while having fewer missiles, had more warheads, with many of America's missiles having MIRVs, multiple reentry vehicles, multiple independent reentry vehicles, MIRVs. So each rocket could carry multiple warheads, so that in space they would break up and go to many different targets. And so this restricted the number of rockets, and therefore, while the Soviets had more rockets, the U.S. had more warheads. No limit was placed on new systems, but the two sides agreed to talk. And so the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, is going to lead to further discussions and the creation later of SALT II. Now, unfortunately, SALT II is not going to pass Congress, but it certainly opens up the venue of discussions. Then Nixon did something that shocked the world. Nixon decided to open relations with China, with Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, doing yeoman's work, visiting with the Chinese and working to bring about a meeting between Nixon and the Chinese to ease the tensions of the Korean War, to ease the tensions of the Vietnam War, to kind of open up. Remember, when China's civil war occurs, the United States backed the Chinese government. The United States continued to back the Chinese government even when that Chinese government is in exile in Taiwan. So the United States had always argued that the Taiwanese government was the legitimate government of China. And you have, during the Korean War especially, MacArthur threatening to bring Chiang Kai-shek back and reintroduce the Civil War to China, which is not in Chinese interest. So of course they're going to oppose American involvement in Korea. And they supported their ideological brothers in Vietnam. And so Nixon's desire to open up relations with with China comes as a shock to the world. Of all the presidents who've held office, Nixon would be the last one anyone would envision opening up normal diplomatic channels with China. But that's exactly what he does. President and Mrs. Nixon travel to China. They visit with, you see, the premier of China, Zhou Enlai, greeting Nixon as he gets off the plane. And by the way, you see in the back, that's a red carpet staircase built in the back of a Cadillac convertible that they would roll up to Air Force One and unload the president in airfields that didn't have terminals that went out to the plane. And so Air Force One, you see Nixon and Pat Nixon meeting Zhou Enlai, and then Henry Kissinger meeting with chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, and then Nixon meeting Mao Zedong. And so working out economic treaties and commercial treaties and recognition treaties with China. And so Nixon has the international coup of the year. He pulls off something no one thought possible. The United States normalizes relations with China. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, you know, depending on how you view China buying American debt today and our trade deficit with China. You know, that could have been a bad thing. But the United States has always had a relationship with China, and this actually returns the United States to a better place than the ongoing conflict. Nixon in the White House, while there's national conflict, Nixon proved to be a stabilizing force, at least during his first administration. Nixon was an avid bowler. You see him there on the left, bowling on the White House bowling alley. It was said once that he bowled 300 games straight, and that his normal score, his bowling average, was a national secret. But Nixon also opened up the White House to popular entertainers. You see Nixon with Elvis, inviting Elvis to the White House, and Nixon with Pearl Bailey. And you see Nixon sitting at the piano playing. He was a very accomplished piano player, and so he quite often entertained guests in the White House to musical renditions. And not just torturing them with his music. He was actually very good at it. And then in the White House, Nixon's older daughter marries Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, but while they were in the presidency, his younger daughter, Tricia, marries Ed Cox. And of course, anytime there's an event like this in the White House, it opens up the president, but Nixon, more so than others, is opened up to the criticism that he's using the People's Building for private events and private affairs. And it's not really a fair criticism, but Nixon seemed to attract more of it than others. And so Nixon had quite the fair term, even though the economy and domestic agenda wasn't the great. So 1972, Nixon decides to run for re-election. And his opponent is going to ultimately be George McGovern. But in the 1972 campaign cycle, Richard Nixon is fearful that Teddy Kennedy, the third of the Kennedy brothers, Teddy Kennedy is going to run for the presidency. In fact, he does run as a candidate for the nomination. He doesn't get it. Ultimately, George McGovern does. But Nixon is incredibly afraid of Kennedy dirty tricks. He didn't trust Teddy Kennedy. He had no respect or love for Teddy Kennedy, and he was fearful of what the Kennedy machine was going to do to him. And so in 1972, and I'm getting this from, and I've mentioned it to you before, but I mention it to you again, Chris Matthews' dual biography of Kennedy and Nixon. It's a very good book, and it's a fair book, taking both men to task for both what they did and what they didn't do. But Matthews insists in that biography that Nixon developed a paranoia of all things Kennedy. The dirty tricks pulled on him in the 1960 campaign that cost him the election, missing ballot boxes, the busing of voters, the buying of votes with cigarettes, with other items to get their vote in Illinois, certainly fueled Nixon's distrust of the Democratic political machine. And in 1972, in a heated campaign with McGovern, it's not even close. Nixon wins the presidency by a landslide, which is reflective of how Nixon is perceived. Nixon is seen as a good president, and unfortunately for Nixon, if he could have frozen at this point or not engaged in what he did during the campaign in the Watergate scandal, he would have left office as one of the greatest presidents that had ever held the office, especially if he could have turned the economy around. Unfortunately for Nixon, this is going to be overshadowed by the shenanigans that occur during the campaign. And so as Nixon is inaugurated into office, there begins to be rumors that during the campaign, the men associated with the Committee to Re-elect the President, unfortunate acronym called CREEP, had broken into Democratic headquarters at the Watergate office complex and hotel as well, but the Watergate office complex, and that those men had been caught in a break-in. And that simple burglary by men associated with Nixon's re-election campaign led to Nixon using the power of his office to cover up what they had done and to cover up not only their crime but his involvement with him. If Nixon had just admitted the truth, it would have been bad, but nowhere near the level of scandal it became. But because he uses the power of his office to try to cover up the scandal, it becomes far worse. And so Nixon is easily reelected. His cabinet very much the same as what he had before. But no sooner is he in office than corruption swirls around Vice President Spiro Agnew. Now you still get, Spiro Agnew was accused of tax evasion and accepting kickbacks while he was governor of Maryland years earlier. And so Agnew's forced to resign. And so for the first time in history, using I believe the 26th Amendment, Congress has to appoint a vice president so that the chain of command is preserved. And so the House Minority Leader, Gerald Ford, is selected to serve as Richard Nixon's vice president. And so Gerald Ford, not elected as vice president, becomes vice president by a vote of Congress. As the years of his second term unfold, the Watergate scandal grows because of the work of Bernstein and Woodward. You might have seen the movie All the President's Men. I read the book All the President's Men. I believe Robert Redford plays one or the other of them. I don't know if it's Woodward or Bernstein, but I love Bob Woodward's writings, by the way. He's written many books, but Carl Bernstein not as much. But they were dogged reporters for the Washington Post and for ABC News, and they kept digging into the connections between the break-in and the 5 men arrested in the break-in, James McCord, Virgilio Gonzalez, Frank Sturgis, Eugenio Martinez, and Bernard Baker, and their connections with the president. And then the cover-up by the Attorney General and others within the Nixon administration. In fact, it may be even greater than that. As I've been researching on this, there are a number of these men, James McCord and Bernard Baker, who were also, there is the belief that they were involved with the assassination of Kennedy. There were 3 homeless men, three tramps, questioned in the area of Dallas, the Grassy Knoll and the Book Depository. 3 men who were questioned by the FBI and the police with regard to their connection to the Kennedy assassination. There was nothing found there. They were let go. When looking at the pictures, they're almost identical to two of the three guys are almost identical to men here. Coincidence? Who knows? Maybe there's a connection. Maybe the assassination of Kennedy goes deeper. Who knows? So Bernstein and Woodward, in their investigations of the Watergate break-in, provide enough evidence for Congress to appoint a special prosecutor. And the initial special prosecutor is Archibald Cox. And as he begins his investigation, Nixon orders the Attorney General to fire Archibald Cox. The Attorney General does, then immediately resigns. The Assistant Attorney General moves up and resigns. And the next third-ranking member was going to resign as well, but was persuaded by the previous 2 Attorney Generals to stay because the chain of command in the Justice Department needed to be preserved. Ultimately, a new special prosecutor was appointed, Leon Jaworski. By the way, he's from Texas, San Antonio region. And Leon Jaworski would begin the investigation of the Watergate break-in and the cover-up. It was discovered that President Nixon had installed in the White House and throughout the executive office complex a series of tape recorders to record conversations. With dignitaries, with visitors, whatever. You can call it Nixon paranoia. You could call it trying to create a record to fall back on. In dealing with hundreds of students every week, I can understand where a recording system would be valuable, because you talk to a student and then you immediately talk to 5 more and you don't get to make notes or whatever about what you talked to the first one about, and weeks later they come up and say, hey, did you look at my grade or whatever, and you forget about it. And the president deals with far more people than a mere instructor, and more powerful people with national commitments on the line. And so the investigation of Leon Jaworski found enough evidence that the president had in fact launched a cover-up. But the key evidence that was needed were the tapes from those presidential recorders. It then led to a series of cases with Nixon and Nixon's legal team claiming that was executive privilege. Congress saying it was a criminal matter and those tapes should be turned over. Ultimately, the court ordered the tapes turned over, so Nixon turned over a transcript of edited tapes with especially an 18-minute section missing. So then the fight was to get all of the tapes turned over, and ultimately when they were turned over, a number of things were revealed. One of those things was Nixon knew all about the Watergate break-in, that Nixon was involved up to his eyeballs in ordering the cover-up, and that he had used the power of his office, which is an impeachable offense, had used the power of his office to undermine the investigation. But on top of that, Nixon was also shown to be a foul-mouthed president. The image that he portrayed to the people, to that silent majority, as a virtuous doer of good, was undermined by the transcripts of those tapes. And when the news on the 6 o'clock news played excerpts from the tapes for the American people, they had to constantly bleep out bad words that Nixon was saying. TV back then wasn't like TV today, where you can get by with just about anything on the air. Back then, you know, even damn was considered an egregious word, and Nixon was pretty potty-mouthed, and it certainly undermined his support. And so Richard Nixon decided to, instead of fighting it out and waiting as the Justice Department began, the Senate Judicial Committee began holding hearings and investigating whether charges of impeachment should be drawn up, and Hillary Clinton was part of that team drawing up the charges of impeachment. As those proceedings moved toward the impeachment of Richard Nixon, he decided to resign instead of facing impeachment. I really believe him when he said he wanted to save the nation the trauma of an impeachment. And so Nixon resigns on August 9th, 1974, his famous farewell as he boards Marine One to fly to Andrews Air Force Base and to leave. And so Nixon is on his way out. And now it falls to his new vice president, Gerald R. Ford. The only unelected vice president now becomes the only unelected president. And Gerald Ford is going to have to deal with the cleanup from the Nixon mess and what to do not only about Nixon, but the economy, world affairs, and to bring it back into the living room of Americans with a just and equitable settlement. But we'll pick up there next time with Gerald Ford.